I was originally asked to do a approximately 10 minutes talk here, but because of changes to the program, they've actually allowed me to expand this. And they were a bit worried that this was last minute they allowed me to expand. I said, no, that's easy. Getting things into 10 minutes is hard. Getting them into 20 minutes is much easier. I was going to start with a statement about how I was going to approach it, which was to make it a bikini, which is as brief as possible, provocative, but covering all salient points. But now I've got 20 minutes, maybe it can be a one-piece suit instead. So I actually bring together, I think, many of the themes that we've already talked about today, particularly in the open source and digital sovereignty panels. So I want to first talk about the hyperscaler hairs and how we got here with the American companies dominating the cloud landscape and the concerns that we have about them dominating these other landscapes, the edge, IoT, and real AI. And when I say real AI, I mean getting rid of the AI slop LLM stuff. The real AI, which is actually making changes in things like Industry 4.0 and in public services. Actual real machine learning, which is getting somewhere with these things. The large US internal market was a key element of this. Ignore those people who say it's all about the lack of US regulation. The biggest thing that allowed the US hyperscalers to work was the large US internal single market. When these guys started in the 90s, the US already had a real single market. It was less than 10 years since the EU had tried to create the single market in the early 90s. We weren't there yet. We're still not really there with the digital single market. And that's one of the things that's really holding back. We heard that in the digital sovereignty panel earlier, that lots of European companies still primarily work nationally. We need to accelerate our movement to create the real digital single market in Europe in order to allow our companies to compete against the American hyperscalers. There was also an earlier adoption by both businesses and households in America of the internet. That gave them a leg up. But crucially, yes, there is a regulatory issue here, and that's the lack of meaningful antitrust scrutiny in America. Since Reagan in particular, it goes back before Reagan in the US, but particularly since Reagan in America, the whole antitrust regulatory landscape has been decimated. It's been gutted by America. And the whole point of that movement was to allow for the creation of monopolies and oligopolies, which we have allowed to then dominate the European market as well. Because while our European antitrust legislation is applied quite rigorously in most European member states and across the EU, we have strong impositions of a prevention of government subsidies. This is all focused on the European level playing field, and it's a good thing. But the trouble is, we then don't apply that to foreign companies which then come into the European market, and the lack of borders of the digital marketplace has meant that we allowed these US hyperscalers to dominate the European market while being subsidized by their large government contracts. These are the hidden subsidies. Almost all of the major American hyperscalers have huge government subsidy going in. And the last one is, well, historically, people used to say no one ever got fired for buying IBM. And I think in the last 15 to 20 years, nobody got fired for buying AWS or Azure or Google Cloud. And we need to get away from that. These are the hairs. They've raced away ahead. But when you get to the stage of having a monopoly or a dominant duopoly, you get to what was referred to, what was introduced as a concept in about 2015 academically as platform decay, and what in recent years Cory Doctorow has dubbed Enshittification. Became the word of the year last year, I think it was, according to some of the dictionaries. And they deal with this in a number of ways. Often the first hit is free. One of the problems is when you have these large players is they offer free or very cheap entry-level access. And when you've got particularly small companies who outgrow their on-premises IT, they need to look at what the options are. And we need a way of providing a way that these companies can be provided with that entry-level move to the cloud, or increasingly to develop edge computing or develop IoT or enter into the AI market. We need a way of giving them an entry level. And again, that was mentioned in the digital sovereignty panel, that we need a way of connecting small companies with the resources they need. Because once the first hit is free, they've got you then locked in. Once you know how to use AWS, you're not going to then learn how to use a different cloud provider. And in particular, AWS makes it hard to move to a different provider. It's part of the Enshittification. You also have the network effect rule. When other companies are using the same thing, if you need to work with them, if you're both on the same cloud provider and there's no interoperability between these systems, it's easier to keep working with that. Or when you look at what you need, who you need to work with, and they're all using AWS or they're all using Azure, that's a pressure to you use the same thing. That's why we need the interoperability and the portability to make sure what other people are using doesn't restrict you in what your choice can make. We also have a problem with the antitrust in that they focus at the top level. And they look very much at the mergers between large companies. And this is often too late. Let me give you an example from the consumer space. When Meta, or Facebook as it was then, bought Instagram, what were they looking for? Did they need their couple of million users? Not really. Facebook had 1 billion users. Did they need their technology? Not really. Facebook already had most of it, and they had enough engineers that they could reproduce it. No, what they did with Instagram was they bought up a potential competitor before it became even close to competing with them. And we're allowing this, particularly the Americans are allowing this, but this is something we must try and avoid in Europe. We must avoid setting up these oligopolies, these monopolies, by allowing them to buy up their smaller competitors. We need very strong antitrust enforcement here. They maintain, when necessary, some plausible competition. If you've got 2 or 3 companies and they're all not deliberately collaborating but just looking what each other are doing and not competing, then a top-level, easy antitrust thing is saying, well, you know, there's competition in this marketplace. But once they've got that dominance, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 companies, then they start squeezing. First, they squeeze their workers. Amazon's famous for this. One of the worst places in the world to work, apparently. But then they also start to squeeze their customers. They push things onto their customers that they don't want. They start monetizing their customers' data. And lately, they're trying to shove LLM AI slop into everything. And when you've got your customers over a barrel, that's easy to do. But they also squeeze their suppliers. And finally, if you let them get too far, they start squeezing the governments. And we see now what's happening with the lobbying of the big tech companies against the DMA and the DSA. That actually tells us that the DMA and the DSA are moving in the right direction. It's the squeals from the dominant players, primarily from America, and of course their bought and paid for political partners in Washington. Europe needs to stay strong on this, otherwise we end up with gutting our own industry by applying these rules internally, but still allowing these large overseas companies to work through it. But this gives us an opportunity to be the tortoise in this race. Now is the time. The DMA, the DSA, some bits of the CRA, it's a controversial topic. I wasn't here, unfortunately, due to plane problems for the open source talk this morning. There are some issues with the CRA about how it interoperates with the free software movement, and we need to be careful about that. But other aspects of the CRA are, again, moving in the right direction. Holding people to account, holding companies to account when they try and pass on the downsides, the next external effects, the externalities of their business onto their customers. We need interoperability. This is one of the first things that makes us be able to do things like federation. But interoperability on its own isn't enough. We need portability. We need to be able to take our data. We need to be able to take our service. We need to be able to take our network of connections with us from one provider to another. And we need to help Europe use its own services. EU's national, regional, local governments can not only show us the way, but can help prime the pump. There's been talk in the sessions this afternoon about the difficulty of getting small and medium-sized enterprises up over that hump to become a national or an international player in their fields. And we have some examples of this from positive moves. In Austria, the army adopted LibreOffice and moved away from the Microsoft monopoly. One of their ministries recently moved to Nextcloud and away from one of the hyperscaler cloud services. It's entirely possible to do this. And with governments who are less concerned about the pure bottom line, I'm not saying governments should be profligate with their money, but they're less concerned with the pure short-term bottom line. Governments can be looking at 3 years, 5 years down the line. They can be looking at what the benefits to their citizens of having better security and better privacy is, and not just about whether they will save a couple of €100,000 here and there. Another example of this is, why does Microsoft Office, finally, after many years of people pushing it to, why in the late 2000s did Microsoft Office finally start reading and writing ODT and ODS file formats? And I'll tell you, it was because the UK government adopted OASIS file formats as its publicly facing file format. And it's not perfectly applied, but there is a UK internal government policy that says if you are delivering data to the public, that's citizens or companies or third sector, then you must do so via PDF, if it's a document to be printed, HTML, if it's a document to be on the web, both open standards these days, or if it's something to be interacted with and edited, it has to be an OASIS document. Now, I was involved in some of the consultations that the UK government had on that, and the Microsoft people were pushing very hard to first adopt them, or if not, to at least allow DocX. And we were saying to them, look, a coalition of people from industry, from academia, and from digital rights organizations saying, why are you telling people they've got to buy an American proprietary piece of software in order to do something which either they need to do to interact with their government, or that you're even mandating them to do? You're requiring organizations and individuals to fill in these forms that you're putting out in Excel format. And yet there is an open alternative. And once the UK government, and a couple of other governments around the world, adopted this sort of mandate, suddenly it became possible for Microsoft to read and write ODT files because they were worried about losing their ability to sell at all into UK government sector. So there are lots of opportunities, particularly in this moment of enshittification, We need to be pushing the fact that if you want AI in your system, you can have open AI systems, not open AI, open washed systems, but actual open AI systems. But if you don't want LLM AI in your system, you can. You can have LibreOffice with or without an AI integration. You don't have to submit to Microsoft forcing you or trying to force you into using their AI. The EU's concept of pooled sovereignty gives us the roadmap of what we can do in digital sovereignty. We use open protocols and FLOSS, free libre open source software. We make sure things are as interoperable as possible, as federatable as possible, as portable as possible. We look at the externalities, not just the digital externalities, but the environmental externalities and the monetary externalities. We look at things like renewable energy and water usage of these systems. We also need to look beyond the borders of the EU. I'm based in Japan. We have the EU-Japan Digital Partnership, we also have the EU-Korea Digital Partnership, and we have the EU-Canada Digital Partnerships. South Korea and Canada are already members of Horizon Europe and will probably be members of the next framework programme. Japan is negotiating to do that, and I'm fingers crossed I will soon be available to be involved in many more European projects. We need to leverage these and bring these partners into our discussions on the pooled sovereignty that these things give us. When things are open, interoperable, portable, that means we can have European cloud providers working in Japan, Japan cloud providers working in Europe, and if there is a national security issue, they can be switched to local ones. But where we do have the ability to work together, we can do so. But underlying all of this, we need serious antitrust considerations, not just applied to European markets and to these markets in these other countries we're partnering with, but we need them applied to other countries as well. And those providers, particularly from America, need to be operating on the same level playing field. The DMA and the DSA are steps in the right direction, but we need to push even further on that, and don't get intimidated by the American government or the American companies. So that's where I finish. I hope that's been provocative and interesting for you. I think it brings together, from what I've seen, some of the things we've talked about this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Hello, hello. So thank you very much for a brilliant speech. Quite controversial as well, and I would say really nice introduction to the following speech we'll be having. But before we go for that one, do we have any questions for Dr. Andrew? So sorry that I had the first here.
Thank you. I totally buy your position. A couple of things. In 2021, when we started discussing the IPSI-GIS framework, we wrote something that was called the Chapeau text. So basically all together, putting their ideas. And after 1 year from the beginning, DigiComp came to us, it's not a secret, and say remove the digital sovereignty word and hyperscalers from all the Chapeau text, because we cannot go with that in the trade organization, and our proposition is too disruptive, you know. So the idea to IPSI is to do exactly what you have here was forbidden, okay, in 2022. So it's a pretty recent position here, and to which I totally buy with you. In the meantime, 800 million tender by the European Commissions on AWS and Azure technologies is being released, and they continuously, each after year, they release huge things. So I don't see the blue flag changing, at least the approach. you can propose AWS, Azure, or alternatives, which is on your proposition, but nothing which supports the migration toward a new ecosystem that you are writing here. So I also know that Microsoft has what they call the killer switch, and I will close it, which means you are not with us, we cut the lines, and you are alone in Europe, which is a menace, not a technology, okay? So what's your understanding and believing that's going to happen in the next 5 years in the European market? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can that answer be quite short, please?
Yes, very, very quick answer. The US trade representatives for 30 years have been creating what Drahush and Braithwaite called information feudalism. And they've been imposing, to the benefit not of the American economy, not to the benefit of America as a whole, but to the benefit of a small number of American large companies who've been basically corrupting their governments with funding, a hegemony that's gone worldwide. Again, I think we have the political enshittification moment at which we can respond to this. We need to be pushing the European Commission and the member states to mirror the US trade representatives' approach on this idea of pooled sovereignty. They need to stop being scared of the Americans. We've got the examples of how you can break with Microsoft. And if Microsoft are threatening us, well, find an alternative. The Austrian army showed us the way. Though we have alternatives, let's do it before Microsoft decides to pull a plug or before the Trump regime tells Microsoft to pull the plug on us. We know that that threat's there. Let's get away from out underneath it.
Thank you very much. We will have to close the talk now. Thank you very much, Dr. Andrew. Huge round of applause.